Yes, thank you, Bianca. Thanks to all of you for being here. Thanks to the organizers for making this great event happen. I'm really glad to be able to speak here at an event where we all, I assume, share the passion of using our lives to help animals, to end animal suffering. And yeah, sorry again that Adriano can't make it. And I'm Max, as Bianca said, and am Director of Strategy at Sentience Politics, the think tank Adriano co-founded. And I will give the presentation called Metaactivism, how you can save many more animals with your wallet than with your plate. And yeah, to start with, I would like you to consider a question. That is, if you plan to use your life to dedicate it to save as many animals as possible, spare them from horrible conditions on factory farms or other kinds of suffering, have you ever considered the question, how many animals do you expect you will be able to save with your activism during your whole life? So if you never thought about that, maybe take a while to think about it, and yeah, I'd be happy to hear some guesses or answers. Anyone, what would you guess? How many animals could you conceivably save? Okay, it's a hard question. I agree. Yeah, I wouldn't be, if I wouldn't give this talk, I probably wouldn't be able to provide an easy answer for myself. And maybe you might even question, okay, why is this a relevant question? Why should I ask it? And this is precisely the first topic I want to address. So why asking about the numbers of animals? Then in the second and third part of my talk, I want to provide answers as promised in the talk title. So roughly how many animals can you save with your plate, for instance, by being vegan? And how many animals can you save with your wallet, that is, with money? And then lastly, yeah, why to consider this? And is there even a better way where we can save even more animals? And yeah, so I would, I plan to, yeah, give this presentation with an open mindset. So I'm happy to, looking forward to the discussion and question in the end. And yeah, I just want to state that the purpose of this presentation is not to attack certain forms of activism or say that some are inferior to others, but yeah, I want to give this a positive framing and hope to show you maybe new tools for your activism and new ways how we can achieve our, I presume, common goal of helping animals in a maybe more effective way than before. Okay, first of all, why this question? Why do I think it's useful to ask myself, how many animals can I save? And, you know, some people, and I share this, this feeling to some extent, might think this is a somewhat uneasy question because yeah, talking about numbers so much, maybe you feel this is somehow amounts to doing mathematics with lives or is an overly cold and calculating approach. Maybe you have feeling like that. I certainly sometimes have them. And yeah, I want to make clear in the first part of this presentation why I believe that it's nevertheless useful to ask ourselves this question. And the first point that is relevant here, I believe, is to bring to our minds that we unfortunately face really huge problems. I'm sure you all, or most of you, are aware of those sad numbers, but I'm going to quote them nevertheless again. So 70 billion, this is 1,000 of million land animals are slaughtered for food worldwide every year. In fact, many more of those animals die because of the food habits of the majority of the population. For instance, according to one source, in the US alone, over 140 million of chickens suffer to death before slaughter because of the bad conditions in which they are raised. And unfortunately, if we consider the harm we do to marine animals, the numbers become even worse. So it's estimated that roughly 1 trillion fish die every year because of human food habits. And so those are just some examples of instances where animals have to suffer due to human causes. And I don't quote those numbers to decrease our motivation or to advocate hopelessness. Quite the contrary. I believe we shouldn't be let down and use those numbers to make clear to ourselves that it's really vital that we try to be as effective as possible in alleviating and preventing this unfortunately huge amount of animal suffering. Because the fact is, at least in the short run, unfortunately, even with all our passion and all our activism, we won't be able to end this, all of this animal suffering completely. And I believe what we therefore have to do, at least in the short run, is to prioritize. So if we cannot save everyone, even if we don't like it, we have to make choices about who to save and who not. And so the question is, how should we do this prioritization? And I believe that at this point, it becomes relevant to ask ourselves, okay, how much suffering can we prevent with one action, with one form of activism, as opposed to another form of activism? And in fact, this is something we there should be a picture, but don't worry. This is something we already do regularly when the fact that we are faced with a moral catastrophe where we cannot save everyone is more obvious to us. So imagine you encounter a pair of burning houses, and in one house, you know, one individual might die if you don't save them, and in another house there are 10 individuals that may die. And unfortunately, for some reason, you don't have the time to save the people from both burning buildings. Then it seems, or maybe the third alternative would be to do nothing at all. And if faced with such a situation, the natural choice, what most people would tend to do is to say, okay, all other things being equal, we should save the 10 people in the larger building. This doesn't only happen in thought experiments. So if, for instance, doctors arrive at the site of a medical emergency and there are more wounded individuals that can be treated immediately, it is already routine that they unfortunately have to prioritize their helping efforts and exercise what is called triage and try to see, okay, who would benefit how much from treatment, and they try to save as many individuals as possible then. Another instance where we already regularly are faced with prioritization is when designing certain policies, such as, for instance, our healthcare systems or traffic laws. If, for instance, we consider whether there should be a speed limit on certain streets or not, it seems to be a highly relevant input if this will lead to more or less accidents and death and suffering. So to sum up, I believe we already use this heuristics of when we cannot save everyone, to save the greater number. We use it in thought experiments. We use it in real life situations where it is more obvious that we are faced with a catastrophic situation where we can't help everyone. And we also use it for large scale policy decisions. And yeah, so even though we would maybe like to save all the animals, owing to the fact that we unfortunately can't do it, I believe we should strive to save as many of them as possible. And this is why I want to ask this question, okay, how many animals can we save with different forms of actions and of activism? Okay, so maybe you now think, I'm totally on board with this, so this is all clear. But why should one give a talk about this? So isn't it obvious and maybe easy to achieve? Maybe we just have to try as hard as we can. And unfortunately, this doesn't seem to be the case, because if we don't analyze the situation carefully and only rely on our intuitions, then decades of psychological research have shown us that our intuitions aren't particularly good at identifying the most effective actions, that is, the actions, those actions that save the most animals. For instance, one classic study asked one group of people how much they would be willing to donate to save 200 birds from drowning in oil. And they asked another group of persons how much they would be willing to donate to save 2,000, that is 10 times the number of birds from drowning in oil. And unfortunately, the amount of donations those two groups provided were nearly the same. So if we just ask ourselves intuitively, how much are we moved emotionally by a certain situation, this emotional motivation isn't in proportion to the number of victims affected. And there are a lot of similar research findings. So I have the list of these so-called cognitive biases where we are predictably irrational, that is, systematically fail to achieve this goal of saving as many individuals as possible. I have this list of those biases here behind me, and you can see it's quite large, unfortunately. And this is why I believe, yeah, it can pay off to think this through carefully and really analyze the situation, this moral catastrophe of factory farming we are faced with, and yeah, use careful analyzing and empirical evidence to determine how we can save as many animals as possible. Okay, and the first thing that maybe comes to your mind if I ask you how can you save a lot of animals is with your plate, that is, with changing your or others' food habits. Because after all, it seems, I talked about factory farming a lot, then this seems sort of the natural choice, right? Those animals, they suffer because people think they want to eat them. And yeah, so it seems this is maybe the first idea that comes to mind. And yeah, as we all know, it actually works. And yeah, I believe we should in fact be more vocal and positive about this. So suppose you were actually faced with this situation, with the thought experiment I talked about before, with this burning house, and you were actually able to get into this house and save one individual from burning there. This would be great, right? You would probably remember that day for a whole time and feel really good. And as we will see with the numbers I quote, if you're a vegan, you do this, the equivalent of this more than once every day. So you are saving one individual every day. Yeah, just a quick reminder. I will quote a lot of numbers or some numbers at least in this talk, and all of those numbers include marine animals, which changes the numbers quite dramatically. I'm saying this just to avoid confusion, because maybe you have some numbers in mind that differ and are vastly smaller, and this could then be due to the fact that with the numbers you are familiar with, marine animals aren't included. So in this talk, always with marine animals. Okay, so I want to ask now, how many animals do you save? Of course, it depends on the particular circumstances, but on average, how many animals does a vegan save? And it turns out that people looked into this already. For example, the author of the awesome countinganimals.com blog, and he estimates that with a vegetarian diet, this is actually only, I believe, you save around 500 animals every year. So more than 1 animal per day. And in fact, analyzing this is a bit tricky. So this is not only about slaughter numbers or anything like that, because as I mentioned before, actually a lot of the animals that die because of the fact that meat eating is so widespread aren't slaughtered directly, but actually most of those animals are killed as so-called bycatch. That is, they are fishes or shellfishes that are killed without then being eaten, or are animals that are then fed to farmed animals. Yeah, so for land animals, the number would be around 25 per year, I believe, and then mostly chickens. Okay, and I want to really use this momentum to make clear for a while why I believe that that veganism is great. This relates to what I said in the beginning. I really don't want to phrase this talk as a conflict between different forms of activisms or different forms of action, because of course you can be vegan and donate, for instance, and so on. And okay, so why is veganism so great? Because the first thing is it actually works. Every vegan spares more than 500 animals every year from horrible conditions in factory farms, or from a horrible death after being caught in the sea. And also, I believe it's to some extent really great that veganism, or this vegan food norm, one could even say, in our movement is that widespread, because we have to be mindful, I think, of the history of our movement. And in the beginning, there was a lot of perhaps a little speciesist attention that was given specifically to companion animals or other animals humans tend to care about more. And the vegan food norm really embodies the progress that we now take an anti-speciesist viewpoint and consider equal suffering equally, no matter whether it's endured by companion animals a lot of people find cute, or by animals that are raised for food. Okay, so I really don't want to attack veganism in any form. What I want to say now is that we can do even more. And one thing that comes to mind, of course, is being vocal about veganism, telling other people why you are vegan, convincing a lot of other people to go vegan, or at least reduce their meat consumption as well, because this way you can multiply this impact of being vegan. But in fact, this is not what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about another approach. Because as great as veganism and this approach of saving animals with our plates is, I believe we should also invest more time to consider other battlegrounds, as it were. So we are very, very much used to talking about animal suffering in the context of food. We think of vegan outreach as maybe a core part of ending animal suffering. And I think it can pay off to consider whether the plate is really the most favorable battleground, because there we have to actually make people change their behavior in in a lot of ways. And so even people who theoretically maybe are on board with anti-speciesism, or in some sense don't want animals to suffer, they could then tend to rationalize their food choices and come up with reasons why, oh, this isn't such a pressing problem after all. If we can move the discussion to other arenas, to other battlegrounds, however, we could gain a lot of more support. And one of those other battlegrounds could be, I believe, not so much talking about, or in addition to talking about people's food choices, talking about, instead of what they consume, whether they consume at all, or whether they, for instance, donate the money. And as I hope to make clear, this can be a really impactful strategy, because the impact of effective donations can be very, very great. And to start off, I would like you to consider a thought experiment, and I really want to make clear that this is a hypothetical thought experiment, because I don't want to contribute to the myth that vegan food is necessarily particularly expensive. But for the sake of this thought experiment, I would ask you to consider the hypothetical situation where vegan food is more expensive than it in fact is. So suppose you would have to spend an additional €3 every day to stay vegan, because otherwise, for some reason, you couldn't get vegan food. What I would like to ask you is then, so who of you would then choose to stay vegan nevertheless? Please raise your hands. Okay, I see quite some hands. Interesting. Maybe of course, for some people it maybe really wouldn't be possible. Then we should be mindful of that of that possibility. But those of us who could afford this, many of us would be willing to pay this price, it seems. Okay, so this price, I said €3 per day. This would amount to roughly 1,000 euros per year, right? And so because I assume you are not into veganism as an end in itself, but rather for those benefits, for the impact of preventing animal suffering, what this would mean, in fact, is that you would be willing to spend 1,000 euro for this impact of saving 500 animals every year, as I said before. Now, there are two lessons, or there's one lesson we can learn here, I believe. Because, of course, the good news is this was a thought experiment. Vegan food actually isn't that expensive. So you don't have to pay those 1,000 euro to get this impact of saving 500 animals. But, in fact, there is this option of saving $1,000, spending $1,000 to save a lot of animals. It's there all the time. And this option is donating this money to an effective animal advocacy organization. And here you can ask as well, how many animals could you save by this means? And there is an organization called Animal Charity Evaluators from the US who looks into this question and tries to find out, by examining all the evidence there is, how much good different animal advocacy organizations actually do. And their top recommendations, they estimate that with an additional donation of $1,000, they could save around 10,000 animals. So this could be organizations who, for instance, do undercover investigations and then publicize them, and then because of them, some people will go vegan or reduce their meat consumption. Or it could be organizations who advocate a vegan diet directly. And it turns out there are methods that have a very high leverage. So with one undercover investigation, you can get the attention of a lot of people if it's picked up by the media. Or leaflets to hand out at colleges, for instance, they are very, very cheap. So even if only like 1% of the people who get them actually change their food habits, you will have a great impact. And this is how we can understand why it's possible to have such a large number here. Okay, so let's pause for a moment. What this means. A lot of you are would be willing to save $1,000 for vegan meals in order to save 500 animals every year. And it turns out that you don't need to do this, but you can spend $1,000 and save 10,000 animals. So many, many more animals. And so I think we should really ask ourselves the question, why aren't we promoting this great opportunity more, both within our movement and as a movement, as a message we send to people who aren't on board yet and who we want to convince. Because as we see here, it can be much more impactful to get people's money, in fact, than to get them to change their food habits. There is one caveat I should mention. This only works if you really exercise caution where you donate. So it's not that like with every donation, no matter where it goes, you will save 10,000 animals if you spend $1,000. But rather what we find here is that the impact of different charitable organizations varies by several orders of magnitudes. So in the graph behind me, you can see that if you give the $1,000 to a typical animal shelter, you will probably save around 2.5 animals. And if you give the same $1,000 to a highly effective organization, you can save roughly the 10,000 animals I mentioned. And why is that? It is of course related to the fact that there are many more farmed animals that suffer by human hands than, for instance, companion animals that are treated in shelters, or even many more farmed animals than animals that are used for abused for vivisection. And unfortunately, as you see in the right box, the amount of the way we allocate our donations currently isn't proportional to this fact. So a lot of money goes to animal shelters, even though there are way less animals involved there than with factory farming. And this makes plausible why the difference in impact can be that high. So in a certain sense, maybe then we could say that with respect to our donation habits, where by our I don't necessarily mean the animal advocacy movement, but say the people who donate to animal causes. If we look at the donation habits, there still seems to be this perhaps speciesist bias that we manage to overcome in a certain sense with the vegan food norm. With respect to our donation habits, it's unfortunately still there to some extent. So there is a lot we can do there. Okay. So I said that with spending $1,000, you can save as many as 10,000 animals. Now maybe you wonder, okay, why is he telling us this? Because I imagine a lot of you like don't have $1,000. For instance, I couldn't easily just donate $1,000 to some charity. It would be quite a large amount of money for me. And yeah, I imagine several of you can relate to that. But in fact, I believe this is actually one reason why it is so important to talk about this topic. Because the animal advocacy, in the animal advocacy movement, a lot of organizations struggle with getting enough funding, and a lot of activists struggle with their personal situation, for instance, because they still have to work in some day job in parallel to their activism, because no organization has the money to employ them full-time. So yeah, the movement doesn't have a great deal of money, and the situation is even more severe than in some other social movement, it seems. So we at Sentience Politics, we asked several other animal advocacy organizations how much room for more funding they have that is based on the quality and number of applications they get, for instance. How many new staff members would they expect to be able to hire with additional funding? And it turned out that this room for more funding is quite large. So yeah, we as a movement, we could greatly benefit from having more financial resources, I believe. And this is in fact another reason, maybe not so much for individual activists to donate their money. This isn't what I want to suggest here, but to get a lot of other people to donate to our cause. And in fact, this would really be only a small step toward leveling the playing field. Because if you compare the budgets of even the biggest animal advocacy organizations, such as the Humane Society of the United States, that's the biggest green circle on the left, or PETA, they are very, very small if compared to the budgets of our enemies, if I may use this term. So what you see in the red bubbles is not even the whole budget, but just the advertising budget of several companies that are part of the agricultural or meat industry. So, for instance, if we do some kind of public campaigns, we currently can't spend the same amount of money on marketing, on advertising, or whatever, than the companies whose opposition we so often face. So this is another reason why talking about money, I believe, even if it can seem a bit perhaps yeah, as calculating is an important thing, we need to do more. Okay, so I hope I could convince you that it would be better if our wallets would be like this, filled with money. And I believe there are two ways we can try to achieve this. So to introduce the first way, maybe ask yourself, or maybe I may ask you, who of you would like to be a full-time animal activist that is dedicate their life to saving animals without having to keep another day job or profession? Please raise your hands. Okay, a lot of people in here, as I would have guessed. And how many of you are actually able to do this? Okay, as I thought, wave your hands. And this illustrates that at least before we can maybe get a lot of more money into our movement, we face some sort of coordination problem. So we are all here together, and we share a common goal, but there is a lack of resources for us to all pursue activism. Or if we decide to all pursue activism, then we can only do this, then everyone will face suboptimal conditions. So maybe one way out here could be if we coordinate more, and some people who are particularly enthusiastic about or good at activism, they become full-time activists, whereas some other people who are in a good position, both in terms of their personal preferences and their skills, who are in a good position to get high-paying jobs, maybe they should just take the high-paying jobs and donate a lot of the money they earn to animal organizations. And this, the good thing here is this can be done to varying degrees, of course. So you don't have to go in a you don't have to go into finance, for instance, and earn a lot of money. No, for instance, in Switzerland, a school teacher can earn 10K per month, and even after deducting the high living expenses there, could donate if he or she is really passionate about saving animals, could donate maybe 5 or 6K per month to an animal advocacy organization and maybe pay for several full-time activists there. So one solution could be to coordinate better, and for some of us to pursue those high-paying or not so high-paying jobs and regularly donate to animal advocacy organizations. And this isn't just a hypothetical idea. It's already put into practice, in particular in the so-called effective altruism movement, of which sentience politics is a part. So I in fact know like concrete individuals, colleagues of mine who aren't colleagues in the sense of being full-time activists that work at sentience politics, but colleagues in the sense that they work in some job where they earn money and donate a lot of it. And I am deeply grateful that, for instance, my position at sentience politics is secured by the activism of Dutch people. And I really think we should acknowledge that this is a kind of activism as well. Yeah, so this idea is called earning to give. And a lot of more and more young people put it into practice, and I believe it can be really, can greatly increase our capability to help animals. But of course, let's not forget the second way to increase our financial resources, that is talking in our public campaigns, in our leaflets and so on, talking more about how much people can achieve through donating and not only talking about their food choices, because this way we can also get more money into the movement. Okay, so what I did up to now was first explaining why I believe it's important to ask ourselves the question how we can be as effective as possible, how we can save as many animals as possible. And then I compared the number of animals you can save with your plate, that is by going vegan, with the number of animals you can save by donating, and discussed some implication this could have for our movement. For instance, people pursuing earning to give, or us being more vocal about the great impact other people can have with their donations to us. The final question I want to ask is, can you even do better? So save even more animals than with this donation of 1,000 euro to a highly effective animal charity that, for instance, hands out leaflets. And the following example, I believe, suggests that you can. So I should mention that this example is a sister organization of sentience politics. It's called Raising for Effective Giving. And what it does is it does fundraising for other highly effective charities. So it basically puts this idea I just laid out into practice of convincing other people, not so much maybe to change their food habits, but to donate. I should mention that the numbers here they don't only relate to animal-related causes, so raising for effective giving also raises funds for fighting global poverty, for instance, or preventing risks associated with new technologies. So this all is included in this $1 million figure, but I think the example still stands. It is possible through fundraising, through first multiplying the money we have by doing effective fundraising, and then investing it in those highly effective work, such as undercover investigations or leafleting, to have an even higher impact. So the example of REC suggests that it's possible to first increase the amount of money you have by a factor of 10 if you do clever fundraising. And so then maybe you could, instead of 10,000 animals, save 100,000 animals if you first multiply your money through as it were, through donating to a fundraising organization. And this kind of fundraising is only one example of what I call meta-activism, to finally connect to the title of this talk. So meta here means instead of directly helping animals, directly preventing or alleviating their suffering, to do something that first increases our capacity to help animals. So this could mean, as the example showed, to do fundraising, then we have more money, so we can help more. It could also involve research. So for instance, those organizations where I got the numbers from, animal charity evaluators, they also increase our capacity to help animals because they show us where we can direct our donations to be most impactful. And finally, another type of this kind of meta-activism is movement building, convincing more people of anti-speciesism, drawing more people into our movement, have them share our priorities, and cause them to either become vegans or effective activists or people pursuing this earning to give type of activism I mentioned, or of course all of this. So yeah, of course, being vegan and pursuing earning to give isn't mutually exclusive, of course. And yeah, this is, I guess this is kind of what we try to do at Sentience Politics, be a meta-organization of the animal advocacy movement and community. So we try to combine anti-speciesist philosophy and priorities with this guiding principle of the effective altruism movement, that we should strive to save as many individuals as possible. And so we put into practice several of those kinds of meta-activism. We do research, for instance, on what kind of political or legal campaigns are possible in different countries. We put some political initiatives into practice. For instance, in Switzerland, we were able to bring about a ballot, a public vote on fundamental rights for primates in the canton of Basel. And we may want to even get a ballot initiative at the national level there of the ground, so that the whole population of Switzerland would vote on the abolishment of factory farming. And yeah, we do this not only because we believe we can change the situation, we can save a lot of animals with these political initiatives, but also because they are really, really great for movement building. You get a lot of media attention. You can really get a societal discussion about speciesism off the ground. You can get a lot of more people who are willing to donate, who are willing to work for animal advocacy organizations, who go vegan, and so on. So in a certain sense, those political initiatives are just a vehicle to build and shape our movement. So both to increase the pie of resources that is available for helping animals, and also to try to spend this as effectively as possible. And yeah, we started, as I said, we started in Switzerland, but are now expanding to a global level. We just made our first hire in the US. Our main office is already based in Berlin, in Germany. We probably will hire people in India, in Latin America, in Australia. And yeah, we are really enthusiastic about putting into practice this kind of meta-activism at a global scale, and thereby contributing to saving as many animals as we can. Okay, so to sum up, maybe during the talk, some numbers were in your mind related to the first question I asked. And if the numbers I quoted are correct, then these are some candidate answers. So if you're just a vegan, then by your dietary choice alone, you will save more than 50,000 animals probably in your lifetime. If you donate $1,000 per year through your whole life, you could even save 1 million animals. And if you do meta-activism, as illustrated by the example of raising for effective giving, or hopefully, even if less tangible, by sentience politics, then you can save a multiple of this million. Perhaps in the case of REC, 10 times 1 million, and perhaps in the case of even more effective meta-activism, even more animals. So lastly, let me mention again, this is not, of course, an all or nothing question. So, or shouldn't be seen as pitting several forms of activism or strategies against each other. You can, of course, be vegan and donate. And also, obviously, I'm not saying that all our activism should be meta-activism, because this kind of meta-activism only works if there are also highly effective organizations who implement directly impactful strategies. So if we all only did fundraising, but no one did something with the money, of course, this would be no good. But I believe that similarly, it is no good if we all pursue only direct activism and neglect this kind of meta-activism. And yeah, we tend to think that this is indeed the case, and that therefore, as a comparably new player, as the effective altruism or sentience politics more specifically is, we should focus on this kind of meta-activism and believe this is where we can contribute the most to the movement. And I would, of course, be very happy to discuss this shortly. Okay. I want to conclude with some more or less concrete action points or lessons I believe we can learn from this discussion. So I would hope that the arguments I gave in this talk maybe convinced you that it could pay off in terms of the impact you can have to think more carefully about what to do with your own time, with your own career, whether you should become a full-time activist, whether you should maybe pursue earning to give or something else entirely, because those are not the only possibilities, of course. And maybe even more important, I would be really glad if we could all embrace earning to give or donating more general as a form of valuable activism. So at least in certain cases, I believe it's not helpful to think of us, the activists, and then our donors as like the others, as not being part of the movement. I believe if we view earning to give as a kind of activism, which is embraced by all of us, yeah, this would be great, and yeah, would increase the popularity of earning to give, and thereby the amount of resources we have available. And thirdly, don't only ask people if you talk with them about animal suffering or speciesism. don't only ask them to go vegan. Maybe also, or depending on the context even, instead ask them to donate. This can be a very highly impactful strategy. Okay. This is the end of my talk. Thanks for your attention, and yeah, I'd be happy to hear your thoughts and yeah, discuss those suggestions with you. Thank you.
Thank you. So, do we have any questions or comments?
Yeah, hi, and thank you very much for your talk. Although I do accept the premise that channeling more money to effective causes is, of course, extremely important, I do have an issue with one point in particular. Your utilitarian approach is basically about numbers, about maths, and you can't discount certain elements of that math calculation that you've done regarding tax. Unfortunately, we don't live in a state that is not permeated with speciesism. Given the impact of money, the impact of one single euro, I think you can't ignore in your calculations the fact that if I earn money, I'm actually going to support that system. I'm going to give a lot of money to fund big ag, to fund the emptying of the oceans and so on. So how do you respond to that? How do you take that into account versus the approach of saying, okay, it seems more healthy in a way to be an activist and to earn as little money as you need to get your basic needs and to ensure that your future is ensured.
Yes, thank you very much for this question. So I would totally agree that it can be for many people more maybe healthy, as you said, to be a full-time activist rather than to do earning to give. And this is one of the reasons why I said I would be glad if we could coordinate about this and start having a conversation about this, because maybe this is, so what I would expect is that this is true for some people. So some people maybe absolutely couldn't or wouldn't want to work in like conventional industries because they would encounter all their colleagues who regularly eat meat and so on, for instance, or wouldn't be in such a supportive or anti-speciesist environment. And this, of course, can be a very hard personal cost for some people. And I absolutely wouldn't advocate that people go into earning to give, even though this might be bad for their personal or even mental health. So I absolutely wouldn't advocate this. But then on the other hand, maybe full-time activism also comes with certain challenges, and some people's health might actually be not so much suited to the challenges you face when doing full-time activism. So I would expect that it's possible to identify people whose comparative advantage, as we would like to say, is to go into full-time activism, and other people who could do earning to give. Then with respect to the question, okay, aren't there, but isn't maybe the negative effect those people who are doing earning to give have? Isn't this negative effect greater than the positive effect they have through their donations? And here I would say, I can definitely imagine that this can be the case in some jobs, and then I wouldn't advocate taking those jobs. So if you are, I don't know, it probably wouldn't make much sense to become an executive of a agricultural industry company and do earning to give. But with some other jobs, for instance, I mentioned school teachers in Switzerland. I guess we do need
I
school
think
teachers.
those are really valid points. But the fact is, it's not about jobs. It's about government. The fact that you're contributing. I'm not advocating tax avoidance. I myself haven't thought this through a lot. But the fact is that you're financing governments, and you can't escape that. And those governments are actually, in a way, a big enemy in that combat we're advocating.
Yes, so I agree. We should analyze the situation, but I would believe that in most cases the positive effect you will have through your donations is much bigger, because one thing is also the issue of replaceability. So if you aren't in this job, another person will be, and then will pay the taxes to the government. But on the other hand, this other person probably wouldn't donate as much to animal advocacy organizations. So I believe, especially after taking this fact into account, we will usually find that earning to give really has a net positive impact. But I agree, it's a valid concern, of course, in principle.
Okay, so there was another question.
Right. Thanks a lot. And also thanks a lot for bringing up the discussion about metaactivism. I think it is a very, very important issue that has not been discussed so much yet. But still, I have maybe two questions. I think what you are telling about vegans saving animals and based on this donations saving animals, this looks nice, but it has one premise that your food choices are correlated with the numbers of animals being killed. But what I have been noticing lately is that this is not necessarily the case. Like, for example, in Germany, there's been falling numbers of people eating meat. And I think the number has been regressing by 2% every year since 3 years. But on the other hand, the number of animals being killed for food is rising constantly because of exports and the whole global meat market. So I just wanted to ask whether you considered this fact in your work and like in the premise of your calculations. That is one point. And the other one is a question, because obviously this meta-activism only works in a context of people doing, let's call it the conventional activism, like going out on the streets, handing leaflets and activities like this. But you say that meta-activism would potentially be a highly effective form of activism, or I possibly could agree with this, but still I wanted to know what is the what relation would you see, like one meta-activist for 5 conventional ones, or what are the relations between these two kinds of activities? I don't know if you understand what I mean.
Yes, thanks for those questions. So with respect to the first question, you asked whether this correlation between us stopping to eat meat and less animals being killed really is there. And my understanding is that there is kind of an expert consensus by economists that this correlation is there. So probably if we hadn't stopped eating animals, then the number of animals killed would have been even higher now. And one interesting fact that's worth bearing in mind is that, so we find this phenomenon you mentioned, that the percentage of vegetarians or vegans increases in the population, but the slaughter and the number of animals slaughtered increase as well. We find this in a lot of developed countries. And this is not only due to exports and other effects, but also to the fact that people who still eat animals shift their consumptions from beef and pork to chickens. So as I briefly mentioned, nearly all land animals that are slaughtered for food are chickens, and they provide much less meat per animal than pigs or cows. And therefore, if people continue to eat the same amount of meat, or maybe even reduce it a bit, but eat more chickens in relation to cows or pigs, then unfortunately this will have this effect of the slaughter totals going up. And therefore, sorry, this is maybe slightly off topic, but therefore it's for the animal movement important to pay attention when such shifts are advocated, maybe for environmental reasons or so, because there is then, in fact, a conflict between the environmental and animal suffering causes. To the second question, I don't really have a short answer, I'm afraid, so I don't know. I'm highly uncertain what the optimal share of meta versus direct activism is, but I'm quite confident that we should increase the share of meta activism. For instance, maybe one fact that illustrates this is this chart. So if we could make the money which is there already in terms of donation, if we would allocate this more effectively, already this could have really, really big effects. This is one of the reasons why I'm confident that more meta-activism is good, but I don't really know how far this should go. We would constantly have need to re-evaluate, I guess.
Yes, hello. First of all, thanks for your speech. This really this picture that I want to talk about, because if you ask to donate more, but people already donate a lot for shelters, but shelters maybe don't need so much money as people give. If the money was used for labs, what would have been done? Is it using the research for other things than research on animals? Because of course, as vegans, we don't accept this. So what does the meta organization think about doing in labs instead? And yeah, this was my question.
Okay, so I would say that at first glance, the fact that nearly all animals that are abused or killed by humans are farmed animals, even if we also include lab animals, as the left chart shows, there are much fewer lab animals. Then at first glance, I would say this provides a strong reason to focus on factory farming as a problem. And for instance, to channel the money to organizations that do undercover investigations, or maybe corporate outreach or leafletting. And so as I said, at first glance, I think it can make sense to do work on lab animals, in fact, if it is done in a way that optimizes for movement building benefits. So for instance, I mentioned this political initiatives advocating basic rights for non-human primates, or actually I'm not sure whether I mentioned it, but this is one of the political initiatives Sentience Politics does. And if such basic rights for primates were introduced in the canton of Basel, this would directly mostly impact lab animals. That is primates that are used in vivisection currently. But here it's important to keep in mind that we aren't only doing this for the sake of helping those lab animals, which is of course one important motivation, but because we believe this is a highly impactful strategy to getting a broader discussion about speciesism off the ground. So for instance, all the households in Basel will receive our arguments in written form and we get a lot of media attention and so on, because this is the way the political system in Switzerland works. And so I believe there are examples such as this, where it can make sense to do something, do some kind of public campaign maybe related to lab animals, even for effectiveness related reasons.
Thank you for the speech. It's not really a question that I have so much as a comment to the to what the gentleman up in the front raised regarding, you know, if you work for a high-paying job and then you end up paying a lot of taxes that end up going to the government. I would like to just add that in many countries, you have, when you do donations, you have tax cuts. So ultimately, you actually reduce, by making donations, you reduce the money that ultimately goes to the government, whereas you increase the money that goes to the animal rights campaigns. And in addition, you know, street activism or other campaigns are a very effective way of you know, raising awareness, but nevertheless being present in these industries, such as finance industries, that are less exposed to activism, just being present in that circle and being a professional, financial professional, for example, all the while being an activist, raises awareness also in those circles and, you know, adds legitimacy to the fight. So it is important that we, you know, stay together, but it is also important that we sort of, you know, infiltrate the circles that otherwise would be less exposed. So just by being amongst professionals that are less exposed, we raise awareness as well. So that is a positive net impact that is not taken into account in the methodology.
Yes,
Do you
thank you. Good
comment
points.
on that? Okay. Well, maybe that's a topic for like a discussion later on over lunch, or maybe would you like to get back?
Again, it's just the mathematics of it that are a problem for me, because indeed I do get tax rebates for my donations, but I get tax rebates of 2/3, which means that I do give extra money to the state too. So it's about, you know, that point. Maybe we should be focusing. Effective altruism is probably much more impacting in countries. I think Switzerland would be one of them, where people would actually have an impact on the way their money is used, which is absolutely not the case in France for the common citizen.
Okay. Yeah, well, like I said, maybe you can have like a longer discussion. There was another question over here.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I just wanted to comment that we also have to always consider where our heart is. So, for example, my heart is much more in activism. I hate asking for money, and but I know many people who prefer to donate than being active on the street or being active in their offices or elsewhere. So, for example, last year I chose to cycle from UK to Poland, and I know many people would use it to fundraise money for an organization, whereas I wouldn't ask my friends for money, or it would be difficult for me. So instead, I asked my family and friends to go vegan for the time I was cycling. And it was also very effective activism, because one person is a vegan now, another person's changed her food choices, and I have very positive comments from others. So I think the main point from me is that if you can ask for money from your friends, family, or anyone else, it's good, because the organizations needs money to work. But if you are not one of the people who like asking about money, you can be very effective elsewhere. So just listen to your heart, because if I start asking for money, I won't be effective, because just undermined I will be, oh no, it's not really my thing. So it's very important to do something where you are good. Thank you.
Okay, we have another question here.
Yeah, hello. Thanks for the presentation, which was really interesting. So I have a question about the concept of own to give. So, for example, to take my own example, so I'm a lawyer, and I know a good way to make a lot of money, which would simply be to be business lawyer in Brussels, and thereby I could maybe donate 1,000 euro per month and thereby save 10,000 animals. But the problem is I would probably have to defend big companies which might import and export animal products, and actually my activity could harm animals. And you know, my main problem is how could I calculate this? Because in my view, not the whole reality is calculable. And even if it was, let's assume my activity harms to 5,000 animals. You know, from a medical point of view, I would still save a lot of animals, but would this be acceptable from a moral point of view?
Thanks for this question. So I should maybe first acknowledge that there is no like universal answer to the ethical question, whether it would be acceptable from a moral point of view. So some ethical views would say it is acceptable, some others say it wouldn't be acceptable. But what I believe is a really strong argument in favor of the view that it would even then be acceptable. Like if you save 10,000 animals on the one hand and through indirect effects harm 5,000 others. This would be that if you try to consider the victim's point of view, the point of view of the individuals who suffer, then presumably their primary interest is for this suffering to end. And they probably wouldn't care so much about how exactly this comes about, that their suffering is being ended, but their most visceral interest would be, I don't want to suffer anymore. So I think this provides a strong, at least at first glance, a strong reason for this focus on effectiveness. That being said, I would doubt that empirically the numbers are in the ballpark of what you cited, especially if one takes into account or is willing to take into account the replaceability consideration I mentioned earlier. So because if you weren't to defend those big companies, some other lawyer would, and maybe you are a bit better than this other lawyer. So maybe you would really do a bit of additional harm by defending the company better. But it's not a large share of the harm you do there would have come about anyway. First and second, this also alludes to a point that was mentioned in the discussion. Maybe you can even shape your environment there to a certain extent to make it happen that even less suffering is caused by those companies you defend than it would have been otherwise, because maybe you can convince people in your environment there to go vegan, or really don't defend them as hard, or whatever. Yeah.
Okay, so one last question.
Yes. Well, I learned a little bit the girl behind, because it's not always easy to ask for money from my point of view. And I think that a person who will like to donate but still continues to eat meat and use a leather and everything, I think that this person will kill much more animals than the money that she will give for other causes, because maybe she will give for shelter, but will continue in the meantime to eat meat and use animal products. Plus, this person will probably continue to go to like McDonald's, so contributing to big chains instead of boycotting all of these kind of chains.
Yes, so I would totally agree that whenever it's possible to convince a person to donate and to go vegan, we of course should do it. But with respect to the assumption that a person who regularly donates but fails to go vegan will in a certain sense do more harm than good, then yeah, I can sympathize with that assumption to a certain extent. But I think that if those numbers I cited are correct, then surprisingly maybe it won't be true, because the negative effect of not donating $1,000 is much greater, in fact, than the negative effect of eating meat for several years. This just seems to be, it's maybe a bit absurd in a situation, but if the research behind those numbers is correct, then this, in fact, is the situation we face.
So we think we are out of, well, maybe one, is there one last question, like short question?
Maybe a comment on a couple of these last questions, including yours and this one maybe. I think as a movement, we are unfortunately a part of the system, and everything we do, or a lot of things that we do, needs to be funded with money. And we need to make sure that the money comes from somewhere. And the money comes out of the system. We cannot create it anywhere else. And by stepping out of the system, as you maybe intended to with your question, or not just defending the company, but somebody else, as you said, is replacing you as a lawyer or defending a company or anything else. It's a moral question, I agree, but still, with these numbers in mind, saying that any euro or any dollar we can get into our movement out of the system maybe is overcompensating other harmful things that we have to contribute to the system in order to get out money of it. So this might be not a 100% moral, logical thing to do, and I agree that some people cannot just do that, but I think at the end of the day, the system as it is right now, somebody has to do it. We need to get money out of the system in order to get going with our movement. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for that comment. If you have nothing to comment on that, I would say we are done.
No, just thanks for your great questions and contributions to the discussion.
Okay, and thank you for your talk.